How they sell us the motorcycle, unique thought and new masters of the world. Ignacio Ramonet. He has been a Spanish journalist, professor of communication theory established in France. He is one of the main figures of the alternative world movement. How they sell us the motorcycle, unique thought and new masters of the world. Of all illusions, the most dangerous is to think that there is only one reality. Paul Wozlaak. It seems to be a fiction of Jorge Luis Borges. In a distant kingdom, a magnificent and cruel sovereign, clinging to the attributes of his power, locked away in his sumptuous palace, had apparently not seen that the world was imperceptibly changing around him. Until the day of the big decision arrived. Then it seems that, to his great astonishment, he saw that his orders were nothing more than simple noises and did not translate into actions. Apparently the power had shifted and the magnificent sovereign had ceased to be the master of the world. Those who in the great democracies wage endless electoral battles to conquer power, do they not risk, in case of victory, experiencing a disappointment similar to that of the sovereign of this fable? Do you know, at this end of the century, that power has moved? What has deserted those precise spaces that circumscribe the political? Aren't they running the risk of soon putting on public display the spectacle of their impotence, of being forced to beat around the bush, back down, renege on their views, and acknowledge that true power lies elsewhere, out of reach? A major French weekly recently published a survey of the 50 most influential men on the planet. Not a single head of state or government, nor a minister or deputy, from any country, figured in it. A few weeks ago, another weekly newspaper dedicated its front page to the most influential man in the world. Who was it? From Mr. William Clinton? From Pope John Paul II? From Mr. Helmut Kohl? From Mr. Boris Yeltsin? No. Simply from Mr. Bill Gates, boss of Microsoft, who dominates the strategic communication markets and is about to control the information highways. The formidable scientific and technological upheavals of the last 2 decades have encouraged, in various fields, the ultra-liberal thesis of laissez-faire, laissez-passer. And the fall of the Berlin Wall, the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the communist regimes, in addition, have encouraged them. The globalization of sign exchanges, in particular, has been tremendously accelerated by the information and communication revolution. These, specifically, have generated the explosion, the famous Big Bang of 2 sectors, true backbones of modern society, financial markets and information networks. The transmission of data at the speed of light, 300,000 kilometers per second, the digitization of texts, images, and sounds, the already banal fact of resorting to telecommunication satellites, the telephony revolution, the generalization of information technology in the majority of the production and service sectors, the miniaturization of computers and their connection in networks on a planetary scale, little by little have changed the order of the world from top to bottom. Most especially the world of finance. This unites the 4 qualities that make it a model perfectly adapted to the new technological order. It is immaterial, immediate, permanent, and planetary. Attributes, so to speak, divine and that, logically, give rise to a new cult, a new religion, that of the market. Data is exchanged instantly, day and night, from one end of the earth to the other. The main exchanges are linked to each other and work in a loop. Continuously. While, across the world, in front of their electronic screens, thousands of highly qualified, gifted young people spend their days hanging on the phone. They are the experts of the new dominant ideology, the unique thought. The one that is always right and to which every argument, all the more so if it is of a social or humanitarian nature, has to bow. In today's democracies, more and more free citizens feel muddled, trapped by this viscous doctrine that, imperceptibly, envelopes all rebellious reasoning, inhibits it, paralyzes it and ends up drowning it. There is only one doctrine, that of the unique thought, authorized by an invisible and omnipresent opinion police. The commandments of the unique thought. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the communist regimes and the demoralization of socialism, the arrogance and insolence of this doctrine have reached such a degree that, without exaggeration, this new ideological fury can be described as modern dogmatism. What is single thought? The translation into ideological terms of universal claim of the interests of a set of economic forces, especially those of international capital. It can be said that it was formulated and defined as of 1944, on the occasion of the Bretton Woods agreements. Its main sources are the large economic and monetary institutions World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, General Agreement on Customs Tariffs and Trade, European Commission, Bank of France, etc. who, through their financing, affiliate at the service of their ideas, throughout the planet, to many research centers, universities, and foundations that, in turn, refine and spread the good news. This is collected and reproduced by the main organs of economic information and mainly by the Bibles of investors and stock market speculators. The Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, The Economist, Far Eastern Economic Review, Agency Reuters, etc., which are usually owned by large industrial or financial groups. Almost everywhere faculties of economic sciences, journalists, essayists, and also politicians, re-examine the main commandments of these new tables of the law and, using the mass media as repeaters, reiterate them ad nauseam, knowing for sure that, in our mediatic society, repetition is worth demonstration. The first principle of unique thought is all the stronger as a distracted Marxist would not deny it at all: the economic prevails over the political. Based on this principle, it happened, for example, that an instrument as important as the Bank of France became independent without notable opposition in 1994 and, in a certain way, was saved from political hazards. The Banque de France is independent, apolitical, and cross-party, affirms, in effect, its governor, Mr. Jean-Claude Trichet, who adds, however, we ask that public deficits be reduced and we intend a stable currency strategy. As if these two objectives were not political. It defends itself in the name of realism and pragmatism, which the neoliberal essayist Alain Mink formulates as follows: capitalism cannot collapse, it is the natural state of society. Democracy is not the natural state of society. The market, yes. The economy is placed in the command post. An economy liberated, as is natural, from the obstacle of the social, a kind of pathetic bargain whose weight is, it seems, the cause of regression and crisis. The other key concepts of unique thought are known: the market, whose invisible hand corrects the rough edges and dysfunctions of capitalism, and especially the financial markets whose signs guide and determine the general movement of the economy, competition and competitiveness that stimulate and invigorate companies, leading them to a permanent and beneficial modernization, unlimited free exchange, a factor in the uninterrupted development of trade and, consequently, of society, globalization. Both of manufacturing production and financial flows, the international division of labor that moderates union demands and lowers salary costs, strong currency, a stabilizing factor, deregulation, privatization, liberalization, etc. Less and less state, a constant arbitration in favor of the income of capital to the detriment of labor, and a disregard for the ecological cost. The constant repetition, in all the media, of this catechism by revered journalists and by almost all politicians, from the right and from the left, gives it such an intimidating force that it suffocates any attempt at free reflection and makes resistance against this new obscurantism very difficult. It can almost be considered that the 17.4 million European unemployed, the urban disaster, the general precariousness, the suburbs on the verge of exploding, the ecological looting, the return of racism and the tide of marginalized, are simple mirages, guilty and highly discordant hallucinations in this happy world that is building, for our anesthetized consciences, the unique thought. The most frequent, however, is that the markets work, so to speak, blindly, integrating parameters borrowed almost from witchcraft or cheap psychology such as, the rumor economy, the analysis of gregarious behaviors, or even the study of mimetic contagions. Especially since, by virtue of its new characteristics, the financial market has perfected various ranges of new products, derivatives, futures extremely complex and volatile, which few experts know well and which give them a considerable advantage in transactions not without risks, as the financial disaster at British Bank Barings has recently shown. There are barely 10 in the world who know how to act usefully, that is, for their greatest benefit on the course of securities or currencies. They are considered the masters of the markets. A word from one of them and everything can shake, the dollar falls, the Tokyo Stock Exchange collapses. Faced with the power of these behemoths of finance, the states can no longer do much. The recent financial crisis in Mexico, unleashed at the end of December 1994, has shown this in a special way. What weight do the accumulated foreign exchange reserves of the United States, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom and Canada, the 7 richest countries in the world, have against the financial dissuasive power of private investment funds, mostly Anglo-Saxon or Japanese? Not too much. By way of example, let us consider that, in the most important financial effort that has ever been granted in modern economic history in favor of a country, in this case, Mexico, the great states of the planet, including the United States, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund managed, all together, to raise approximately $50,000 million, a considerable sum. Well, the 3 American pension funds, alone the big 3 of today, Fidelity Investments, Vanguard Group, and Capital Research and Management Control, $500,000 million. The managers of these funds concentrate in their hands a financial power of unprecedented magnitude, which is not possessed by any economy minister or any central bank government. In a market that has become instantaneous and global, any brutal change in these authentic financial mammoths can cause the economic destabilization of any country. Weapons of social control. Political leaders of the main planetary powers, meeting with the 850 most important economic leaders in the world within the framework of the International Forum in Davos, Switzerland, in January 1995, said to what extent they disapproved of the new fashionable slogan, "All powers to the world, market," and how much they feared the superhuman power of those fund managers, whose fabulous wealth has been totally freed from governments and who act as they please in the cyberspace of financial geography. This constitutes a kind of new frontier, a new territory on which the fate of a large part of the world depends, without a social contract, without sanctions, without laws, except for those that the protagonists set arbitrarily, for their greatest benefit. The market's vote every day considers Mr. George Soros, a billionaire financier, forcing governments to adopt measures that are certainly unpopular, but essential. It is the markets that have a sense of the state. To which Mr. Raymond Barre, former French Prime Minister and great defender of economic liberalism, replies, "Definitely, the world can no longer be left in the hands of a gang of irresponsible 30-year-olds who only think about making money." He judges that the international financial system does not have the appropriate institutional means to face the challenges of globalization and the general opening of markets. The same is verified by Mr. Boutros Boutros-Ghali, Secretary General of the United Nations. The reality of world power largely escapes the states. So much so that globalization implies the emergence of new powers that transcend state structures. Among these new powers, that of the mass media appears as one of the most powerful and fearsome. The conquest of massive audiences on a planetary scale unleashes Homeric battles. Industrial groups are engaged in a war to the death for control of multimedia resources and information superhighways which, according to the U.S. Vice President, Mr. Albert Gore, represent to the United States today what transportation infrastructures by highway represented in the mid-20th century. For the first time in the history of the world, messages, information and songs, are directed permanently, through television channels connected by satellite, to the entire planet. There are currently 2 planetary networks: Cable News Network, CNN, and Music Television, MTV, but tomorrow there will be dozens, which will influence and disrupt customs and cultures, ideas and debates. And they will disturb like parasites, they will modify or short-circuit the word of the rulers, as well as their conduct. Groups more powerful than the states carry out a raid on the most precious asset of democracies, information. Will they impose their law on the entire world and open a new era in which the freedom of the citizen will be nothing more than a pure illusion? Are we manipulated, conditioned, watched? In a rule of law, is it pertinent to ask these questions? Unfortunately, yes. With growing concern, citizens verify in their daily lives an increasingly strong dominant influence of these new powers and their recent weapons of social control. In this regard, the main character in John Grisham's novel, The Firm, Mitch McDear, exemplifies the fin de siècle version of modern man, trapped in the contradictory gear of his ambitions and his nightmares. First formed, educated in the most demanding schools, conditioned to be the best, MC Dear is hired by a prestigious firm. This, since then, through the most sophisticated communication techniques, has not stopped spying on him, monitoring him and controlling him, surveillance, hidden microphones, wiretaps, telephoto lenses, hidden video cameras even in his own room. In the two phases of this journey, first, Master King, and then, the police attitude, what becomes of the freedom of the individual? What new type of society is being outlined in this way with the complicity of new communication and information technologies? Where are they from then on, the new powers? What new threats hover over democracy? The crisis of the great coercive machines, family, school, church, army, and the failure of the totalitarian states that practice mass indoctrination on a large scale, have been able to make us believe that the citizen was recovering autonomy without restrictions. It is an illusion. Beneath an apparent calm, everything indicates, on the contrary, the reinforcement of social control, this set of material and symbolic resources available to a society to ensure the conformity of the behavior of its members to a set of rules and principles prescribed and sanctioned. Indeed, new, more subtle, more insidious and effective methods of coercion are being installed, while state-of-the-art techniques are emerging, based on electronics and information, to follow the path of citizens in their own footsteps, take note of what standards and punish deviations. No one is safe. In the course of the 1930s and 1940s, totalitarian states, fascists and Stalinists were accused of indoctrinating children, suggesting them and turning them, if necessary, against their own parents. The refinements of propaganda and its effectiveness led to the horrified question, can we become, by the imperceptible effect of persuasion, the opposite of what we are? Is there a fatally dozing Mr. Hyde in us that clever propaganda seems to have the power to awaken? Psychologically impressive and politically disturbing questions, to which since the 1930s they have tried to answer George Orwell, Thomas Mann, Theodore Adorno, Walter Benjamin. They saw in the development of the great electric means of mass communication, microphone, loudspeaker, record, radio, cinema, fearsome techniques to dominate and impose a thought administered from the cradle and during the dream state. Aldous Huxley considered in Brave New World, 1932, it is how infants can be conditioned, better than with the Pavlovian method of punishment and reward, by means of a sound discourse that will repeat to them indefinitely what their rank and status are within the community. Despite their identical genetic capital, these children, after internalizing their social condition, behaved differently and meekly accepted their respective roles within society. What is acquired can override what is innate, said the British writer, who warned against attempts at human domestication. Huxley's warning has not been heeded, and the interventions that are carried out today to condition the little human go even beyond birth. Current advances in biogenetics allow, in fact, to be informed, from conception, of the general state of the fetus, its sex, and its possible deformations or diseases. The existence of these, revealed by ultrasound, can lead to interrupting the pregnancy. The manipulation of certain genes already makes it possible to avoid serious disabling diseases. How far can you go this way? The mercantile criteria of the ideology of profits. Are they relevant in this area? We all feel that it is not, that this would be the open road to eugenics, to choosing the baby from a catalog based on fashions and market arguments. Haven't we recently seen that a black woman in the United States had a fertilized egg implanted so she could bring a white child into the world? The most extravagant delusions in the matter of genetics now become technically possible. Persuasion engineering. But the programmed man is also programmed after his birth. Next to his family, whose ascendancy has diminished, there are other normalization structures that take care of him from very early on. First, television, which has become the main babysitter and primary distraction for children. What do they take from the cathodic cyclops? First of all, the violence. Recent and tragic events have relaunched since. For a few months, the debate about the responsibility of television and the media in the criminal act of children, sometimes very young. Thus, in Liverpool, in February 1993, two 10 and 11-year-old boys kidnapped, tortured, and killed a 2-year-old boy according to a ritual similar to that staged in a horror film, Child's Play 3, which they used to see in the video. In Vitry-sur-Seine, France, in October 1993, 3 school children aged 9 and 10 were involved in the deadly lynching of a homeless man. In Newcastle, England, in 1993, 2 boys aged 9 and 10 were charged with torturing a 6-year-old boy. At the same time, in Saarbrück, Germany, 3 primary school students tried to hang one of their classmates. At the beginning of 1994, in Marseille, several adolescents accused of rape, torture and barbaric acts against a 12-year-old girl, declared to those who interrogated them that they did not know that they were doing something wrong. Finally, in Norway, in October 1994, a 5-year-old girl died after being beaten by 3 5- and 6-year-old boys, once again, in a ritual that mimicked a children's television series, Power Rangers. This last issue mainly provoked, throughout Europe, a lively emotion and reactivated the debate about the impact of certain broadcasts on the youngest children. As a result of these dramatic cases, many countries have taken decisions to limit scenes of violence on television. 2 Swedish networks, for example, decided not to continue broadcasting the series Power Ranger and The Edge, suspected of having exerted a nefarious influence on the Norwegian homicidal children. Under pressure from public opinion, Canadian television, for its part, has provided itself with an ethical code in order to suppress gratuitous scenes of violence from the small screen, as of January 1, 1995. In the UK, the government has decided to restrict minors' access to violent videos. In the United States, the major networks ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox have resolved to remove much of the violent broadcast from their programming. This, above all, to prevent the government from regulating even more severely the representation of violence on the small screen, since 4 out of 5 Americans are convinced that violence on television contributes to increasing violence in real life. And after the American Psychological Association released a report revealing that during the 5 years of elementary school, a child sees some 8,000 murders and more than 100,000 acts of violence on television. In France, lastly, the report of the deputy Christine Baudin prepared in October 1994, within the framework of the Commission of Cultural, Family and Social Affairs of the National Assembly entitled Child and Television, makes 20 proposals to protect young viewers from the excessive influence of television programs. Surveys show that a French child between the ages of 8 and 14 watches television for 3 hours a day on average. And that the number of violent acts that are spread is, in general, perceived as unreasonable and difficult to bear. The Parisian weekly Le Point, in a survey carried out in October 1988, had made a count of all the scenes of violence that viewers had been able to attend during a week: 670 homicides, 15 rapes, 848 fights, 419 executions, 14 kidnappings, 32 hostage takings, 27 torture scenes, 13 strangulation attempts, 11 armed robberies, 11 war scenes, 9 defenestrations. This, by the way, in all the broadcasts and not only in the broadcasts for children, but you have to know that programs for youth do not represent anything more than 30% of the viewing time of children from 8 to 12 years old, so that they watch adult programs for 70% of their viewing time. And, in this regard, it should be noted that among the most violent programs on television are the news. Crimes, atrocities of the wars in Bosnia or Rwanda, suffering of children. It is estimated that about half of the civilian victims of wars are children. Natural disasters and epidemics. The televised news recite the rosary of ordinary tragedies with impressive realism and crudeness. This terribly affects the children who are watching. First, because of the very impact of the images, their intrinsic crudeness, but also because children instinctively know that what they are seeing is true, real, and that it has nothing to do with fiction, and also because they listen to their parents' reactions. The news is one of the broadcasts that the family watches together. These comments sometimes shock children because they underline the drama of what they see. The anxiety effect is very strong. Children feel that the parents themselves are shocked, sometimes horrified, by what they are seeing. This anxiety effect translates into psychological violence that can mark the child's mood, impress and disturb him. This can make him get used to violence, to trivialize it and make him insensitive, later, to the suffering of others. To warn against this perverse influence, the American network CBS broadcast in January 1995, under the title In the Field of Massacres of America, a 3-hour documentary, made from the televised sequences during the news, in which the disfigured corpses accumulate, the hallucinatory images of the victims of the ordinary violence of American events. But violence is not the only problem that the habit of watching television poses in children. Before reaching the age of 12, a child will have seen, in France, about 100,000 advertisements that, surreptitiously, will help make him internalize the dominant ideological norms and teach consensual criteria of the beautiful, the good, the fair, and the true, that is, the 4 moral values on which his moral and aesthetic vision of the world will forever be built. Very soon, television will impose emotional criteria as superior to rational arguments. The gulf between rationality and publicity has now widened, so writes the American essayist Neil Postman, that it is hard to remember that there ever was a relationship between them. Today, in advertising television, propositions of logic are as rare as ugly people. The question of whether the publicist is telling the truth or not is not even raised. A McDonald's ad, for example, is not a series of logically presented and verifiable assertions. It is a mise-en-scène mythology, if you will, of very beautiful people, selling, buying and eating hamburgers and displaying an ecstatic happiness. No statement is made if they are not what the viewers project onto the scene or infer from it. An advertisement may or may not be liked. It cannot be refuted. Cartoons, of which children are still great consumers, are not refuted either. If it is true that some are of a remarkable poetic quality and a richness for the imagination, many others present a simplistic, Manichaean way, full of prejudices and extremely violent, 41 acts of violence per hour, on average, in American cartoons. Now, as has been seen, the issue of violence on television and its influence on children is being raised more forcefully than ever. According to Dr. Samuel Lepastier, from the Center for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Santa Ana Hospital in Paris, watching violent shows can have a calming effect up to a certain threshold. Beyond it, the excess of excitement linked to the images is no longer elaborated on the psychological plane. It is there where a discharge of this excitement appears through several pathways. Children may be anxious or have nightmares. To a greater degree, the evacuation is done through games, imitations, bypassing the act. For imitating the hero of a teen movie, the program, who lay down on the asphalt of a highway and remained motionless in the middle of traffic, several young Americans were run over on the roads of the United States in the fall of 1993. This forced the production company, the Walt Disney Company, cut the scene from all copies in circulation and led Congress to demand action against violence on television, which the British government also did on April 12, 1994. This debate moved on to the influence of video games, which have become the main distraction of adolescents. A survey revealed, in September 1994, that 3/4 of French primary school children play video games regularly. Video game. These electronic amusements usually offer many adventure stories. The scripts are usually inspired by real wars: Vietnam, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Gulf, Bosnia. A hero follows an initiatory journey during which he never stops eliminating increasingly fearsome adversaries. Killing, destroying, shooting, are constant acts that these games claim and to which the adolescent proceeds, simply by pressing a button. This small gesture that kills, in the long run, trivializes and unrealizes the very idea of death, a pillar, however, of philosophy and religion in all civilizations. At the age of 18, a young American has thus, without hesitation, eliminated some 40,000 opponents. Professor George Grebner of the University of Pennsylvania, one of the greatest specialists on violence on the small screen, rings the alarm bell. Repeated exposure to violence makes the public anxious and distrustful, exaggerating the risks of aggression in their environment. The more violent broadcasts children watch, the more acceptable violence seems to them and the more it gives them pleasure. They have a hard time discerning what is true from what is false. This conditioning to violence reaches a higher refinement with the spectacular development of virtual reality. Three-dimensional vision helmets with liquid crystals and striated gloves with optical fibers connected to a computer can produce a perfect impression of contact with a concrete reality, however, non-existent. The player is not watching a movie, he is in the movie, circulates through it and interacts in cyberspace. Combats, explorations, adventures of all kinds and laser wars, set up by military simulation specialists seem, from now on, virtually within everyone's reach. Game parks of this type, such as Cinetropolis in Connecticut, near New York, or Virtual World Entertainment in California, the one in Nagoya, Japan, opens in November 1995, as well as experiences of virtual sexuality. Last year, Americans spent $18.8 million on these games and are expected to spend $33.8 million this year. But psychologists are already warning against the dangers of virtual reality. The center of the personality is relocated in a virtual body endowed with superhuman capacities. Upon returning from that trip, the player could suffer a kind of contempt for himself, experience a feeling of insignificance, of increased loneliness within the real world. Ultimately, too frequent exposure to virtual reality would induce a true psychological decomposition, draining the living forces of the personality to the benefit of one or several virtual worlds. Without being pessimistic, one cannot help but wonder about the influence of scenes of violence broadcast on television and video games when one sees how in the United States, for example, where television is one of the most violent in the world, the number of arrests of minors has increased by 60% between 1981 and 1990. In France, the number of crimes committed by minors has risen from 36,000 in 1980 to 48,000 in 1987 and continues to increase. This adolescent delinquency is also increasingly violent and deadly, often directly inspired by scenes on television. The invisible persuasion. There are three other techniques of persuasion that have as their permanent aim the taming of minds: advertising, polls, and marketing. In such a way that they are part of our family environment, the characteristic of the dominant ideology is to be, literally, invisible, that few people are aware of them, shock them, and rebel. With the most refined means and with the help of researchers from all disciplines, psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists, semioticians, linguists, statisticians, etc., advertising tries to unravel our deepest desires. They try to discover, says the American essayist Vance Packard, author of The Clandestine Persuasion. are hidden weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the hope that they will be in a better position to influence our actions. Psychologists at a large American advertising agency conduct experiments on human samples to try to develop a means of identifying people who are anxious, hostile, passive, socially aware, etc., as well as methods of reaching them in their lives. Sensitive points. A Chicago agency has studied the housewife's menstrual cycle and its psychological consequences in hopes of determining what will most effectively persuade her to buy certain food items. When they have obtained this information and with the publicity discourse elaborated, the citizen becomes the target of the target. There is an average of 300,000 messages that bombard you every year. How to escape from it? In France there are 400,000 panels installed to post advertisements, 50,000 buses ride others on their sides and their backs in all the cities, 6,000 advertising spaces are broadcast by the various television networks and movie theaters, as well as tens of thousands of radio spots, not to mention some 3,200 magazines, and dozens of newspapers, that advertise on their pages. How to get out of this bombardment unscathed? All the more so since certain methods, such as the so-called subliminal images, usually illegal, target our unconscious and disrupt our critical defense. This can have serious consequences for the domestic economy with the development of teleshopping that triggers instant purchase impulses. Especially if the remote control and the credit card are connected, as certain recent gadgets propose. Advertising and sales techniques, even the most controversial, serve, on the other hand, as a model for political discourse, especially during electoral periods. Its influence on the citizen, especially that of political marketing, is considerable when choosing leaders in a democracy. The sales techniques, founded on very skillful market studies, pretend to be almost a science. Their goal, to manipulate us, to make us consume more and more. In this respect, the strategies prepared in the hypermarkets to make the consumer fall are amazing. A hypermarket laboratory has even been built in St. Quentin en Yvelines, in order to study purchasing behavior under a microscope. In these experimental stores, the guinea pig buyer is spied on by a team of sociologists and psychologists who follow his every gesture through mirrors without quicksilver. Its route, its stops, its doubts, are thoroughly analyzed. Even the path your gaze follows along the product shelves is recorded by the eye movement recorder, a system that, by studying infrared refraction on the retina, makes it possible to determine which items on a shelf have been observed first, place and for how long. Thanks to the collaboration of architects, decorators, and illuminators, these very detailed observations and surveys on purchase motivations will make it possible to model the interior space of hypermarkets in order to stimulate consumption. Aisle length, shelf size, product location, lighting, colors, everything is calculated so that the customer moves more slowly, stops before a maximum of products and, in addition to the essentials, buys the superfluous. Nothing is left to chance. An example, the electrical appliance, always located at the entrance of the stores, for two reasons: the cart must be empty to be able to receive a large package, and its price will serve as a reference, since everything else will seem less expensive. Even the ambient music is well studied so that the immensity of the commercial ships does not scare and becomes more intimate. In France, 60% of hypermarkets broadcast the same music specially made for them by a company that, via satellite, covers the entire territory. In certain countries, this music contains subliminal sounds, which repeat to ecstatic customers. Indulge yourselves. Relax. Don't steal. Coadjuvant with the publicity discourse, the surveys provide additional information and arguments about the needs of all kinds of citizens. What pollsters are looking for, explains Vance Packard, is obviously why we act, in order, if it can be done, to more certainly tilt our election in their favor. The pollsters investigate, sometimes under false pretenses, behavior, customs, attitudes, and little by little design the profile of the average consumer voter. They thus define public opinion, which, most of the time, is nothing more than the slightly distorted reflection of mass information and advertising. The set constitutes a ring that circumscribes the social norm, consensus, and conformity. Or, as the neoliberal essayist Alain Mink states, the circle of reason. Outside of it are the margin, the deviation, the abnormality. The poles thus establish a new form of conditioning that influences us without being noticed. By constantly reminding us of the desire of the majority, they suggest that we go in the same direction. Since, in effect, the undecided tend to align themselves with the opinion of the majority. Paul Watzlawick, communication specialist at the Palo Alto School, has masterfully shown how an isolated individual ended up doubting his own feelings and how, in order not to stand out, he came to accept the opinion of the greatest number of people. The will to relinquish one's own independence, to barter the testimony of one's senses against the comfortable but reality-distorting sensation of being in harmony with a group, says Watzlawick, is, of course, the food with which one lives. Demagogues feed. They are prowling again in favor of the current unrest, in which they are already at the foot of the canyon, as in Italy, where the elections of March 1994 have seen the deployment of all modern conditioning technologies and also the election of Mr. Silvio Berlusconi. Coercion and surveillance. Conditioning goes hand in hand with vigilance. And the means of exercising it have multiplied tenfold with advances in information technology and the fantastic capacity for control that new tools allow. Nondescript gestures of everyday life. They leave indelible marks on electronic networks, making it possible to reconstruct an itinerary or a way of life. Thus, withdrawing money from an ATM, paying with a credit card, going through a toll motorway, a simple phone call, a teletext query, etc., are just so many little white stones that mark the route, whose tracing can be reconstructed, calculate speed and duration, verify alibis. Subscribing to a magazine, paying taxes, paying the doctor, leave, from now on, traces in computer files. If it weren't for the National Commission for Informatics and Freedoms, CNIL, and the law of January 6, 1978, which in France protects the freedoms of citizens, all information regarding our lives, schooling, health, shopping, travel, savings, relationships, etc. could be confirmed and consulted by the most diverse organisms, banks, insurance companies, employers, merchants, police. In the United States, the American tax services have tried to control tax returns by analyzing the files of mail-order companies. There are specialized companies that scrutinize all the expenses of certain categories of people, define their consumer profile and put this data in files. There are banks that do not hesitate to establish, for their own use, files based on information provided by their clients' expenses. Some go even further. In the UK, NatWest Bank, which manages 6.5 million accounts, put its customers' political and religious views and even their eating habits on file. In the company, where the hiring methods verify the physical and ideological conformity of the candidates to the dominant social norms, the hierarchy can, henceforth, better control the activity of the employees. Video surveillance, which Charles Chaplin and Fritz Lang had envisioned as early as 1930 with Modern Times and Metropolis respectively, has become widespread. Actual duration of work, presence, productivity, and efficiency of employees, all of this can be verified, as well as personal telephone calls recorded in the central computer memory. In 1984, during the occupation of the SKF factory in Ivry-sur-Seine, workers discovered that they were systematically booked by the personnel service on the basis of their political and union views. Such files, which are prohibited, are commonplace, since finding out about the state of mind of employees is part of the job of a human resources manager. Certain firms sometimes use private detectives or surveillance companies to inquire about their personnel. Such an executive, suspected of providing information to the competition, you will be spied on. Such an annoying trade unionist will be wiretapped. And the future looks suspicious. The Olivetti firm has prepared an electronic flea capable of remotely activating a microcomputer. The employee arrives at his office, carrying as a badge a card measuring 6 by 6 centimeters, weighing 40 grams and 8 millimeters thick. Immediately your computer recognizes it and turns on. When he leaves his office, he turns off. Nobody but him can have access to the system. The computer sends out a pulse every 10 seconds to verify the presence of the badge wearer within a 50-foot radius. Olivetti plans to equip the buildings with a multitude of sensors that will follow the employee wherever he goes. Overcome George Orwell's Big Brother, surveillance of employees may, at last, be permanent. Which must make all the police in the world dream. Meanwhile, they are betting heavily on video surveillance. In Paris, on April 12, 1994, during the trial of some hooligans accused of injuries and misdemeanors against some CRS, the images, filmed by television cameras and by an amateur, were shown, which allowed the youths to be identified and imprisoned. These practices are becoming widespread. From now on, the security forces in several countries have their own film crews that film demonstrations and violent confrontations with the police live. In order not to depend on television networks or press agencies, the Spanish Ministry of the Interior plans to install some 250 cameras in the most insecure neighborhoods that will film everything that moves. In a control center, 33 agents will monitor the images to prevent possible crimes and react quickly. And when mass conditioning, surveillance, and control prove ineffective, there remains, as was seen in Milos Forman's film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, one last tool of consent engineering, tranquilizers and anxiolytics. France holds, in this period of crisis, the world record for the consumption of psychotropics, 80.9 million boxes sold in 1993. And Prozac, the miracle antidepressant that came from the United States, has also spread very quickly. The rumor, spread by some doctors, says that with Prozac you go back to being the person you really were. What person? Jekyll or Hyde? In the United States, notes Professor Edouard Zafirian, where violence and crime are treated as diseases of the individual, prescribing Prozac avoids asking nagging questions about the causes social of these disorders. I have ended up wondering if these drugs, consumed in excess, do not play the role of social regulators that allow us to avoid rebellions. The crisis of the Fourth Estate. Exhausted by work, horrified by unemployment, anguished by the future, bewitched by television, stunned by tranquilizers, citizens suffer constant, invisible, and clandestine indoctrination. Can they count on the press, on that resource of the citizen that is sometimes called the fourth power and that traditionally, in democracies, has the main function of revealing the truth and protecting citizens against the abuses of the other three powers, legislative, executive, and judicial? In fact, to put it bluntly, no. Because the written press is in crisis. It is experiencing, in several large democratic countries, a noticeable decline in diffusion and is seriously suffering from a loss of identity. How and why did we get here? Regardless of the true influence of the economic crisis, we must seek, it seems to us, the deep causes of this crisis in the transformation that some of the basic concepts of journalism have experienced over the last few years. First, the very idea of information. Until recently, informing was, in a certain way, providing not only the precise and verified description of a fact, of an event, but also a set of parameters that allow the reader to understand its deep significance. It was to answer elementary questions: who has done what? By what means? Where? How? Why? In what context? What are the causes? What the consequences? This has changed under the influence of television, which occupies a dominant place within the media hierarchy, and extends its model. The televised newspaper, mainly thanks to its ideology of the direct and real time, has gradually imposed a radically different concept of information. Being informed is, since then, showing history in progress or, more specifically, making us attend the event live. It is, in terms of information, a Copernican revolution, whose consequences have not been fully measured. For it assumes that the image of the event, or its description, suffices to give it its full meaning. Ultimately, the journalist himself is superfluous in this face-to-face of the viewer and the history. The priority objective for the citizen, his satisfaction, is no longer to understand the scope of an event, but simply to see it, to see how it occurs under his eyes. This coincidence is considered as happy. In this way, little by little, the deceptive illusion is established that to see is to understand. Now, our modern rationality has been built very exactly against the postulate to see is to understand. The rationalists of the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment had to combat the obscurantist forces that rested on the idea that seeing is understanding. Galileo showed that although I see the sun revolve around the earth, in reality it is the earth that revolves around the sun. And Diderot, with the encyclopedists, would warn that one must distrust one's own eyes and one's own senses. I see the horizon flat, but the earth is round. Since, as popular wisdom says, the habit does not make the monk and appearances are deceiving. Reason and reasoning are what make me understand, and not the eyes. When modern information is based on the idea that seeing is understanding, it contributes to a formidable intellectual regression that takes us back several centuries, to the pre-rational age. And how to claim that every event, however abstract it may be, must necessarily present a visible, showable, televisable part. This brings with it an increasingly frequent reductive emblemization of complex events. For example, the entire scope of the Israel-PLO agreement seems to have been reduced to a simple Rabin-Arafat handshake. On the other hand, such a concept of information leads to a distressed fascination with live images, of events realistic, violent, and bloody events. There is another concept that has changed, that of actuality. What is the actuality from now on? What event should be given a privileged place within the abundance of events from around the world? Based on what criteria to choose? There, once again, the influence of television seems decisive. It is she, with the impact of her images, who imposes her choice and practically forces the written press to follow her. Television constructs the present, provokes emotional shock and practically condemns the orphaned events of images to silence and indifference. Little by little, the idea is established in the minds that the importance of events is proportional to their richness in images. Or, to put it another way, that an event that can be shown, if possible live and in real time, is stronger, more eminent than one that remains invisible and whose importance is abstract. In the new order of the media, words or texts are not worth as much as images. Information time has also changed. The optimal measure of the media is now instantaneity, real time, directness, which only television and radio can practice. This makes the daily press age necessarily late in relation to the event and at the same time too close to it to be able to draw, with sufficient perspective, all the lessons of what has just taken place. There is a fourth concept that has been modified and is fundamental, that of the veracity of the information. Now, a fact is true not because it corresponds to objective, rigorous and verified criteria in its sources, but simply because other media outlets repeat the same statements and confirm them. If television, starting from an office or an agency image, presents a news story and the written press and then the radio give this news again, that is enough to credit it as truthful. This was, let us remember, how the lie about the pile of corpses in Timisoara and all the lies about the Gulf War were constructed. The media no longer know how to distinguish, structurally, what is true from what is false. In this media commotion, it is increasingly vain to want to analyze the written press isolated from the other information media. The media, and journalists, repeat themselves, imitate each other, copy each other, respond to each other, intermingle to the point that they no longer constitute but a single information system within which it is increasingly difficult to distinguish the specificity of one of them, separating it from the others. Cathodic democracies. Finally, information and communication tend to be confused. Too many journalists continue to believe that they are the only ones who produce the information, when the whole of society has been frantically doing the same. There is practically no institution left, administrative, military, economic, cultural, social, etc., that does not have a communication and public relations service and does not issue, about itself and its activities, a pictorial and laudatory discourse. In this regard, the whole system, in the cathodic democracies, has become cunning and intelligent, fully capable of cunningly manipulating the media and wisely resisting its curiosity. Added to all these messes is an essential misunderstanding. Many citizens consider that, comfortably installed on the sofa in their living room and watching on the small screen a sensational cascade of events based on strong, violent, and spectacular images, they can get serious information. It is a major error, for three reasons. First, because the televised news, structured as a fiction, is not made to inform, but to distract. Next, because the rapid succession of brief and fragmented news items, about 20 for each newscast, produces a double negative effect of over-information and misinformation. And, finally, because wanting to be informed without effort is an illusion that has to do with the advertising myth more than with civic mobilization. Getting information is tiring, and at this price the citizen acquires the right to participate intelligently in democratic life. However, many headlines in the written press continue, due to television mimicry, to adopt characteristics typical of the cathodic medium: mock-up of the first page conceived as a screen, reduced length of articles, excessive personalization of journalists, priority to the sensational, systematic practice of oblivion, of amnesia with respect to information that has become outdated, etc. The written press has simplified its discourse at the moment when new powers appear that nobody denounces, and the world, shocked by the end of the Cold War and the technological revolutions, has become considerably complicated. Such a large separation between the simplism of the press and the new complexity of international politics disconcerts many citizens who no longer find in the pages of their gazette a different, more detailed, more demanding analysis than the one proposed by the television news. This simplification is all the more paradoxical as the global educational level of our societies continues to rise and the number of graduates is increasing. Accepting to be nothing but the echo of televised images, many newspapers disappoint, lose their own specificity and, in addition, readers. In the best of cases, in certain countries the written press, in order to escape the domination exercised over it by television, has opened new territories to information. In two areas, the private life of public figures and matters of public interest involving personalities from the political or economic world. The former is extensively exploited, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, by small-format newspapers. The second, more serious, has seen in recent years in Spain, France, and Italy mainly, the renewal of what not so long ago was called investigative journalism and today is designated as revelation journalism. It is, in the proper sense, to reveal, that is, to bring to light what was hidden, to analyze what was hidden, to explain what is not visible. This television, by definition, cannot show it since there are almost never images. These are files, papers, and documents whose display through images adds nothing. In this type of journalism, reasoning and demonstration are once again important figures. Thinking, and not simply seeing, is once again possible, to a certain extent, since many newspapers, and the groups to which they belong, are committed to this path for their own economic survival. The confrontation with television is therefore a priority at the risk of making revelations every day, at all costs, at the risk of forgetting professional ethics or mistreating deontology, thus doubly betraying the reading citizens, taken hostage in this media war, in which all blows are allowed, even the lowest. All the more so since the influence of television, mainly in terms of diplomacy, has not stopped growing in recent years. We have been able to verify this during the great international crises. Without the harrowing images of the bombed-out market in Sarajevo, would there have been an ultimatum from the UN? Without the moving sight of the starving children of Mogadishu, would there have been a military landing in Somalia? Is not safe. In our media democracies, the humanitarian injunction dictates from now on the attitude of the foreign ministers and prescribes an afflictive diplomacy of the audiometer, with the fearsome risks that this entails. If American politics warns Professor George F. Kennan and the recruitment of our armed forces abroad are conditioned by the commercial television industry and inspired by the emotional drive of the people, there will be no more responsible governments. In this regard, a senior State Department official has recently revealed that in order not to act in the former Yugoslavia under pressure from the media machine, President Clinton's strategy consists of avoiding at all costs that Bosnia appears on the front page of the big media. Every day of silence about Bosnia on TV news is a day gained. If the shock of information rips the leaders out of their immobility, should we regret it? Theoretically, no. Since one of the main functions of the Fourth Estate is, effectively, to act as a goad on behalf of the values of democracy. But most of the media would not have the slightest right to claim this noble function, dragged into a drift that damages so much, they are usually no longer worthy of exercising it. Instantaneity, spectacularization, fragmentation, simplification, globalization, and commodification are from now on the main characteristics of information that is structurally incapable of distinguishing truth from lies. As the coverage of some recent events has not ceased to demonstrate, Tiananmen, Timisoara, the Gulf War, Kurdistan, Somalia, and even the bombing of the Sarajevo market, the origin of which has been attributed by the mass media to the Muslims themselves. The information system has been perverted, dominated by television, caught in the trap of appearances, it shows without understanding, and in fact excludes from the real field what it does not show. An example of this disorder, the very serious American network CBS has sent more journalists last February to cover the dubious duel of two Olympic figure skaters than to Sarajevo to follow the consequences of the ultimatum. Already unreliable in itself, this system is on the threshold of a radical revolution with the advent of multimedia that some compare, due to the radical changes induced, to Gutenberg's invention of the printing press. The articulation of the television, the computer, and the telephone creates a new, interactive communication machine, based on the results of numerical processing. Bringing together the multiple talents of the dispersed media, to which telecopying, telematics and montics are added, multimedia marks a rupture and could completely disrupt the field of communication. Just like the new international economic order, as expected by President William Clinton, who has launched the ambitious project of electronic highways to once again give the United States the leading role in the industries of the future. All power to the market. Gigantic mergers are underway between the giants of telephone, cable, computing, video and cinema. Purchases and mergers follow one another, mobilizing tens of thousands of millions of dollars, 5 years from now. There will hardly be a dozen companies left in the arena. Some dream of a perfect information and communication market, fully integrated thanks to electronic and satellite networks, without borders, operating in real time and permanently. They imagine it built on the model of the capital market and uninterrupted financial flows. In order not to be distanced as happened to the South in the 1970s, when the lost battle of the New World Information and Communication Order, Europe has also embarked on great maneuvers. Here too the logic of industrial gigantism is stronger than any other consideration. It has been seen in France, last February, when the hostile takeover of Canal Plus took place. The written press is not safe from this hurricane of ambitions unleashed by the challenge of multimedia. Many of the big newspapers already belong to the communication megagroups. Thus, The Times, of London, is controlled by News Corporation, of Mr. Rupert Murdoch, and La Repubblica, of Rome, by Olivetti, of Mr. Carlo Benedetti. Others, such as London's The Independent, have recently been the target of regular crackdowns. In France, the rare titles that remain independent of the national press, weakened by the brutal drop in advertising revenue, are no longer safe from the greed of the financial powers. This new communicational mechanism and the return of monopolies worry citizens, and rightly so. You remember the warnings issued not so long ago by George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, whose birth centenary was celebrated in 1994, against the false progress of a world managed by a single thought. They fear the possibility of a subtle conditioning of mentalities on a planetary scale. Within the industrial scheme conceived by the bosses of entertainment companies, everyone confirms that information is, above all, considered as a commodity, and that this character is, by far, stronger than the fundamental mission of the media, to illuminate and enrich the democratic debate. This arouses in certain citizens an unlimited submission, an indifference that some call consensus. And in others, an increasingly conscious and violent feeling that the accumulation of abuses, manipulations, and surveillance, at the service of the new powers, threatens to corrupt democracy. At the risk of denying democratic principles and practices, the new masters of the world thus multiply, with the complicity of the states, the preventive surveillance measures, especially of populations increasingly marginalized by the crisis. The futuristic tools of information and communication serve more for the conditioning and the encirclement of the citizens than for their emancipation. Is this tolerable? If nobody controls the guardians of the new social order, what dangers for democracy? Not Mr. Ted Turner of CNN, not Mr. Rupert Murdoch of News Corporation Limited, not Mr. Bill Gates of Microsoft, not Mr. Jeffrey Vinik of Fidelity Investments, not Mr. Larry Wrong of China Trust and International Investment, not even Mr. Robert Allen, of ATT, any more than Mr. George Soros or dozens of other new masters of the world, have ever submitted their projects to universal suffrage. Democracy is not for them. They consider themselves above these endless discussions in which concepts such as the public good, social happiness, freedom, equality, and solidarity still make sense. They have no time to waste. Your money, your products, and your ideas cross without obstacles, in the era of globalization, the borders of the globalized market. In their eyes, political power is nothing but the third power. First there is the economic power and then the media power. And when you have those two, as Mr. Berlusconi has shown in Italy, seizing political power is nothing more than a formality. Finish. How they sell us the motorcycle, unique thought and new masters of the world. Ignacio Ramonet.